Please escort this delivery man to the loading dock out back." Marcus Sterling's voice cut through the ambient sound of a live string quartet playing under the California sun. "The smell of damp earth on his clothes is ruining the atmosphere of our symphony. Remember this exact moment in time. The moment a man sealed his own destruction with a perfectly polite smile. The groom just banished the only person holding the biological blueprint to his $400 million corporate empire." 16 hours earlier, Arthur Vance woke up at exactly 4:15 in the morning. He did this every single day, without fail, pulling his aching frame from a mattress that had lost its supportive structural spring over 7 years ago. The small, drafty suburban house in Vallejo smelled faintly of roasted chicory root and aged library paper. He stood by the kitchen counter in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, brewing a single cup of black coffee using a chipped ceramic dripper, slow, deliberate. He carried the steaming mug to his cramped laboratory study, a room completely suffocated by towering stacks of scientific journals and meticulously labeled glass vials. The desk lamp flickered violently before casting a pale yellow glow over his hands as he smoothed out a heavily annotated chemical schematic. His fingers were heavily calloused, permanently stained with dark ink and chemical residue from 4 decades of relentless, uncredited laboratory work. He was a man who lived entirely in the margins of the world. He walked over to a wood coat rack near the door and pulled down his designated jacket. It was heavy brown corduroy, severely frayed at the elbows, the inner silk lining held together by a jagged row of thick black antistiches. He had clumsily sewn himself back in the winter of 2019. He slipped his thin arms into the heavy sleeves and felt the familiar, comforting weight of the worn fabric settling against his sloping shoulders. He looked down at his feet, observing simple brown leather loafers, with a distinct deep crack running along the entire left heel. They were not made for grand ballrooms. On the dead center of his cluttered desk sat the only physical object that mattered in the world today. A small, intricately hand-carved box made of pale, untreated pine wood. He had spent exactly 42 hours whittling the lid with a pocket knife, shaping the harsh edges until they were perfectly smooth and gentle to the touch. Inside the wooden box lay a small stack of yellowed notebook paper covered in complex biochemical equations, the silent culmination of a lifetime of quiet, agonizing sacrifice. Resting gently on top of the fragile papers was a tiny glass vial of rare orchid essential oil, the exact sweet scent his late wife used to wear on quiet Sundays. He closed the lid carefully, tracing his thumb over the natural grain of the wood. This was his heart. Let us pause and consider the harsh mathematics of poverty and wealth, the invisible equations that dictate human interaction in modern society. A custom-tailored suit from a luxury boutique in Milan costs roughly $6,000, an amount that represents 4 entire months of rent for a working-class family fighting to survive in the suburbs. The imported beluga caviar being circulated on silver trays at high society events is priced at $250 per ounce, consumed in a single, thoughtless bite by men who would aggressively negotiate to cut a junior employee's hourly wage by 50 cents to protect a profit margin. This is not just a simple difference in superficial purchasing power. It is a fundamental, terrifying divergence in reality. Arthur Vance understood this bitter divergence better than anyone else alive. He had spent his entire professional career trapped in the shadows of massive corporate giants, watching greedy pharmaceutical executives monetize his brilliant discoveries while he quietly returned to his modest, underfunded laboratory. He remembered the exact day he finally stabilized the molecular structure of the enzyme that would eventually form the core foundation of Helios Biotech's latest hostile acquisition target. It was a freezing Tuesday, pouring heavy rain, and he had been surviving exclusively on instant ramen and black tea for 3 consecutive weeks just to fund his independent lab equipment. He had logged exactly 14,620 hours of agonizing trial and error before achieving a viable, life-saving compound. That yellowed paper securely hidden inside the pine box was not just a scientific formula. It was a ledger of human endurance. Now, Silver Oak Crest in Napa Valley was a place specifically designed to make ordinary people feel profoundly inadequate. A private, heavily gated vineyard estate sitting atop 200 acres of manicured, pesticide-treated land, where the air itself seemed to be artificially filtered through layers of gold leaf. Valets wearing crisp gray vests and earpieces sprinted frantically between rows of imported European sports cars, their panicked reflections warping in the polished hoods of vehicles that cost significantly more than an average American family's 30-year mortgage. The main estate house was a sprawling, arrogant masterpiece of contemporary glass panels and reclaimed Italian stone architecture. Inside its massive halls, it smelled of crushed white roses and unspoken, toxic elitism. The engagement party budget was precisely $412,500. 400 transparent chairs made of premium ghost acrylic were perfectly aligned on the western lawn, directly facing a massive floral archway, constructed from 3,000 freshly imported white orchids. Professional waiters carried heavy silver trays of vintage champagne, moving through the wealthy crowd with the synchronized, terrified precision of a strict military drill. Every linen napkin was expertly folded to its sharp geometric angle, every crystal wine glass vigorously polished until it was practically invisible under the blinding afternoon sun. Everything was flawlessly engineered to project absolute dominance. Marcus Sterling stood casually near a towering swan ice sculpture, aggressively adjusting the platinum cufflinks of his bespoke charcoal suit. At 32 years old, he was the youngest and most ruthless director of mergers and acquisitions in the bloodthirsty history of Helios Biotech. His wristwatch alone, a rare platinum timepiece featuring a custom sapphire dial, retailed for exactly $89,000 at private auction. He possessed the kind of aggressive, relentless corporate charm that worked absolute wonders in a hostile boardroom, but left a cold, hollow feeling in your stomach once the calculated conversation finally ended. He viewed the human world entirely through the cold lens of leverage. To Marcus Sterling, human beings were not actually living souls with inherent value. They were simply either assets to be immediately acquired or useless liabilities to be brutally discarded. He had spent the last 8 grueling months ruthlessly orchestrating a massive corporate takeover, a $400 million deal that would guarantee his immediate promotion to the global executive board. All he desperately needed was the final legal signature on a core biological patent from some reclusive, eccentric scientist his expensive legal team could not seem to physically track down. He did not care about the groundbreaking science or the thousands of desperate patients the affordable drug would ultimately save. He only cared about the bonus. Marcus took a slow, arrogant sip of his vintage champagne, his sharp eyes scanning the massive crowd of venture capitalists, tech and Silicon Valley elites who had gathered to celebrate his imminent marriage to Isabella. He had strictly and aggressively curated the digital guest list, ensuring that every single person in the room could offer him some tangible strategic advantage, financial leverage, in the next 5 years of his career. He had explicitly instructed his anxious fiancée to keep her side of the deeply unimpressive family to an absolute minimum, citing spatial fire code constraints that simply did not exist on the sprawling estate. He knew absolutely nothing of her father's actual demanding work, only vaguely, recalling that the old man lived in a dilapidated, dangerous neighborhood and wore clothes that rightfully belonged in a charity donation bin. He demanded perfection from the hired string quartet, openly threatening to dock their final pay by 15% if they missed a single note of the scheduled classical repertoire. Isabella was upstairs in the bridal suite, surrounded by loud makeup artists and completely isolated from the logistical cruelty her future husband was currently enforcing downstairs. She loved him, or at least she desperately loved the polished, charming version of him that he successfully presented when the societal cameras were rolling. She kept the peace. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was currently navigating his 10-year-old, severely battered sedan up the winding, sun-baked asphalt roads of the Napa Valley Hills. The car's internal air conditioning system had catastrophically failed 3 long summers ago, forcing him to roll down the manual windows and let the dry, dust-like agricultural air whip through his thinning gray hair. He kept his right hand resting securely and constantly on the torn passenger seat, his rough fingers loosely but protectively gripping the hand-carved pine box. The grueling drive from his small home in Vallejo had taken him exactly 1 hour and 40 minutes, every single mile, serving as a quiet, heartbreaking meditation on the rapid passage of time and the terrifyingly reality of giving his only beloved daughter away to a stranger. He did not care about the exclusive venue or the nauseatingly opulent display of wealth he was about to physically walk into. He only cared about her. He pulled the vehicle up to the imposing wrought iron security gates of Silver Oak Crest, the aging engine of his old sedan, idling with a rough, uneven, and incredibly loud mechanical rattle. The armed security guard sitting inside the climate-controlled glass booth looked up from his digital clipboard, his expression instantly hardening into a strict mask of professional suspicion and open disdain. He demanded Arthur's full name with a sharp, aggressive tone usually reserved for trespassing solicitors or lost delivery drivers. Arthur provided his name quietly, his voice carrying the gentle, gravelly, and tired cadence of a man who spent infinitely more time talking to microscopic cells than to other living human beings. The guard squinted at the glowing digital tablet, scrolled past dozens of high-profile corporate executives and local politicians, and finally found the single, deeply unimpressive entry at the very bottom of the familial guest list. The iron gates swung open slowly. The intimidating engineering, sleek German engineering, and sleek Italian luxury, a terrifying gauntlet of polished steel and dark-tinted glass. Arthur parked his dusty, rattling sedan near the very back of the unpaved overflow lot, intentionally keeping far away from the pristine, heavily insured vehicles of the corporate elite. He turned off the struggling engine, immediately plunging the hot cabin into a sudden, incredibly heavy and isolating silence. He sat there frozen for exactly 3 minutes, looking down at his cracked leather shoes and feeling the frayed, worn edges of his corduroy sleeves rubbing against his wrists. He took a deep, steadying breath, letting the faint, sweet scent of the pine box ground his highly anxious and racing mind. He opened the creaking door and stepped out into the blinding California sun. The loose gravel crunched loudly and awkwardly under his worn shoes as he began the long, humiliating walk toward the main estate, holding the small wooden box tightly against his chest like a protective, sacred shield. The sheer scale of the concentrated wealth surrounding him was physically oppressive, a suffocating and arrogant display of excess that felt entirely foreign and deeply unnatural to a man who strictly measured success in molecular stability and patient survival rates. He awkwardly passed a small group of young, aggressive executives smoking thick cigars near a decorative marble fountain, their tailored Italian suits fitting flawlessly and sharply against their broad shoulders. One of them paused mid-sentence, glancing at Arthur's worn corduroy jacket with a toxic mixture of genuine confusion and thinly veiled, mocking amusement. The man explicitly nudged his wealthy colleague, gesturing vaguely toward the old engineer with the glowing tip of his expensive cigar. They did not say a single actual word to him, but the crushing social silence was loud enough. Arthur did not lower his tired gaze, nor did he steady a steady pace to quickly escape their harsh, unspoken judgment. He simply kept walking with quiet dignity, his eyes fixed firmly on the grand, towering oak doors of the main reception hall, his brilliant mind focused entirely on the small glass vial of orchid oil and the yellowed pages of his life's monumental work. He knew exactly who he was. He knew the devastating power of the equations in his hands, and he knew exactly what his daughter's happiness meant to his battered soul. The arrogant corporate world could keep its vintage champagne, its platinum watches, and its cruel illusions of superiority. He had the literal blueprint of their survival in his calloused hands. As Arthur Vance finally pushed open the massive 10-foot-tall solid oak doors of the Silver Oak Crest reception hall, the overwhelming wave of artificially chilled air and concentrated floral perfume hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The interior space was a dazzling, terrifying cathedral of modern wealth, illuminated by 3 massive crystal chandeliers that fractured the afternoon light into thousands of sharp, blinding prisms across the polished marble floor. He stood alone. In the grand exactly 45 seconds, a frayed brown figure, drowning in a swirling ocean of tailored silk and aggressively curated perfection. Nobody looked directly at him. There is a highly specific, heavily documented psychological phenomenon among the ultra-wealthy when confronted with the sudden, unexpected appearance of genuine poverty in their heavily guarded safe spaces. They do not typically scream or cause a dramatic, vulgar public scene that would inevitably ruin their carefully maintained aesthetic of effortless, inherited superiority. Instead, they weaponize their peripheral vision, creating a seamless, invisible vacuum of social isolation that silently forces the unwanted intruder to the absolute fringes of the room. The silence is deafening. A group of 4 venture capitalists standing near the champagne tower seamlessly shifted their weight and turned their shoulders exactly 15 degrees inward, collectively closing their physical circle the moment Arthur took a step forward. A wealthy socialite wearing a $12,000 vintage emerald necklace simply let her perfectly manicured hand drift over her nose, pretending to adjust a non-existent loose strand of hair while aggressively stepping away from his path. An elderly corporate board member with a terrifyingly smooth, surgically altered face intentionally stepped backward, forcing the older scientist to abruptly halt and nearly lose his fragile balance just to avoid a painful collision. Empathy is incredibly expensive. Arthur felt the crushing weight of their collective, unspoken disgust, but he forced his cracked leather shoes to keep moving forward across the immaculate white marble tiles. He held the small pine box tightly against his ribcage, feeling the rhythmic, anxious thud of his own heart beating against the smooth as he desperately scanned the massive room for any sign of his daughter. The string quartet in the far corner seamlessly transitioned into a complex, rapid movement of Vivaldi, the frantic tempo perfectly mirroring the rising, suffocating panic building inside Arthur's tired chest. He was completely invisible. Let us examine the precise geometry of social exclusion. Operating within the Silver Oak Crest reception hall at exactly 5:04 in the afternoon, the massive room was divided by invisible, heavily enforced boundaries of wealth and power, with the most important venture capitalists naturally gravitating toward the elevated terraces, where the ambient temperature was exactly 2 degrees cooler. Arthur was firmly trapped in the dead zone, a highly exposed area where the catering staff circulated dirty plates, and the less important guests awkwardly lingered before making their calculated moves toward the center of power. Waste is a weapon. He observed a young woman in a stunning crimson silk dress casually drop a perfectly good, half-eaten, imported strawberry onto the immaculate floor, completely confident that an invisible worker would magically make it disappear. The sheer volume of casual, everyday waste in this single room could easily fund his community laboratory's critical reagent supply for an entire fiscal quarter. His calloused thumb traced the intricate, slightly uneven carving on the corner of the pine box, grounding his spiraling anxiety in the physical reality of the rough, honest wood he had shaped with his own hands. He would endure anything. He vividly remembered the agonizing 42 hours it took to stabilize the volatile orchid compound, working through 3 consecutive nights, while his arthritic joints burned with a fierce, relentless pain. The financial cost of the rare flower extract had set his strict personal budget back by exactly 214, forcing him to skip lunch for 17 consecutive days just to afford the tiny glass vial. But Isabella had always loved that specific scent, a delicate, ghostly reminder of the mother who had passed away long before the corporate medical system deemed her condition profitable enough to cure. Love requires profound sacrifice. A young, highly stressed catering waiter, carrying a heavy silver tray of empty crystal flutes, suddenly rounded a towering floral arrangement and nearly collided directly with Arthur's chest. The paused, his eyes darting frantically over Arthur's worn wire corduroy jacket, instantly calculating the older man's precise social value in a fraction of a second. Without uttering a single word of apology, the young man aggressively shoved the heavy silver tray directly toward Arthur's torso, clearly expecting this shabby old man to collect the dirty glassware. Pain rolls rapidly downhill. By aggressively attempting to ta, the waiter was a tiny fraction of power he possessed, the only tiny hammered who viewed them both as replaceable furniture. When Arthur gently refused to take the heavy tray, the waiter's face contorted into a mask of genuine, furious resentment. He whispered a harsh, derogatory slur under his breath as he pushed past the older man's fragile frame and stormed off toward the rear service kitchen. The hierarchy remains unbroken. At exactly 5:12 in the afternoon, the inevitable collision of their two vastly different universes finally occurred near the towering, intricately carved Iswan's centerpieces. Marcus Sterling had just successfully concluded a tense, aggressive 15-minute negotiation regarding offshore tax restructuring, sure with a senior banking executive, when his sharp, predatory gaze swept across the crowded room and locked onto Arthur. The young executive's impeccably groomed eyebrows twitched for a fraction of a second, his highly trained corporate brain instantly registering the severe aesthetic violation standing near the imported caviar station. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks. Marcus did not recognize the man's tired, weathered face from the single blurry family photograph he had briefly glanced at 3 months ago, but he instantly recognized the unforgivable stench of financial failure. He excused himself from his wealthy colleagues with a flawless, devastatingly charming smile and began walking slowly toward Arthur with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. He covered the 42 feet separating them in exactly 18 steps, his posture terrifyingly straight, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the hard marble floor. Power is always quiet. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from the older man, invading Arthur's personal space just enough to establish absolute physical dominance without actually touching the frayed brown corduroy fabric. He looked down at the deep cracks in Arthur's leather shoes, then let his gaze travel agonizingly slowly up to the handmade pine box, his eyes explicitly communicating a level of disgust that words could never adequately capture. "Excuse me, sir, but I believe you have fundamentally misunderstood the explicit boundaries of the service entrance. You are completely lost." Marcus spoke the words with a soft, perfectly modulated baritone voice, the kind of polite, poisonous tone specifically designed to humiliate someone while appearing entirely reasonable to any casual observer. "We strictly require all independent couriers and local delivery personnel to process their incoming packages through the rear loading dock to avoid disrupting the aesthetic flow of the main reception area." Arthur stood perfectly still, his tired, intelligent eyes looking directly into the cold, empty void of the young executive's perfectly symmetrical and terrifyingly hollow face. He did not speak. It would have been incredibly easy, in that exact agonizing moment, for Arthur to loudly declare his true identity and publicly shame this arrogant, impeccably dressed young man in front of 400 elite guests. He could have simply opened the small pine box, pulled out the yellowed, heavily annotated laboratory papers, and calmly explained that the $400 million acquisition Marcus had built his entire career upon was currently resting in his hands. But Arthur Vance possessed a rare, quiet strength forged in the lonely, unforgiving fires of failure and scientific isolation, a profound internal discipline that completely rejected the cheap, fleeting satisfaction of public vengeance. He swallowed his pride. He remembered the joyful, radiant sound of his daughter's laughter when she first tried on her engagement ring, and he absolutely refused to be the chaotic, bitter storm that ruined her one perfect day in the sun. Arthur's brilliant mind automatically analyzed Marcus's aggressive behavior through the cold, objective lens of a seasoned biological researcher, observing a predictable parasitic organism functioning entirely on base, predatory instincts. He noted the slight, unnatural dilation of the young executive's pupils, the aggressive, rigid tension in his jawline, and the overwhelming, nauseating scent of his bespoke cologne that aggressively attempted to mask sheer ruthlessness. Silence is a shield. He knew, with absolute scientific certainty, that attempting to reason with a man, entirely consumed by his own inflated ego, was a statistically impossible task that would only result in further, escalated cruelty. He tightened his grip on the hand-carved pine box, silently protecting the yellowed pages of his life's work from the toxic, corrosive atmosphere of the young executive's boundless arrogance. Marcus misinterpreted the older man's stoic, unbroken silence as the dull, confused hesitation of a lower-class worker who simply lacked the intellectual capacity to understand basic logistical instructions. He sighed very loudly. He let out a soft, highly patronizing sigh, the kind of sound a strict schoolmaster might direct at a particularly slow and disappointing student who had repeatedly failed a simple examination. He casually raised his right hand and subtly snapped his fingers twice, a sharp, crisp sound that instantly summoned two massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors wearing identical black suits and invisible earpieces. They materialized from the shadows of the grand hall in less than 12 seconds, their massive physical presence instantly creating an impenetrable, threatening wall between Arthur and the rest of the glittering celebration. The trap was sprung. Gentlemen, it appears this delivery man's has become somewhat disoriented and requires your immediate assistance in locating the proper external exit. Marcus addressed the towering security guards while maintaining unbroken, chilling eye contact with Arthur, a flawless smile still plastered firmly across his handsome face. Please escort him to the rear loading dock immediately, as the lingering smell of damp earth on his clothes is beginning to seriously ruin the delicate atmosphere of our symphony. Arthur pulled away slightly. I know the way out, thank you. Arthur spoke for the very first time, his voice incredibly quiet, deeply raspy, and completely devoid of the terrified, trembling submission that Marcus had fully expected and eagerly wanted to hear. He deliberately adjusted his grip on the hand-carved pine box, ensuring the fragile glass vial of his late wife's rare orchid oil was perfectly secure against his chest before turning his back on the young executive. He walked away slowly. The walk from the center of the grand reception hall to the exit felt like an agonizing marathon, measured not in physical distance, but in the devastating metrics of human degradation. Every single step Arthur took in his cracked leather shoes seemed to loudly broadcast his financial failures to a room full of people who measured a man's entire worth by the brand of his wristwatch. He kept his eyes perfectly level, refusing to stare at the marble floor in defeat, actively protecting the tiny ember of his own dignity from being completely extinguished by their collective crushing judgment. He was unbroken. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, Arthur caught a fleeting, heartbreaking glimpse of Isabella, standing on the upper balcony. Her back turned to the main floor as she laughed with her wealthy bridesmaids. She looked absolutely radiant in her custom silk gown, completely sheltered from the brutal, ugly reality of the social execution currently taking place less than 50 feet below her elevated position. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp sting of tears threatening to blur his vision, but he aggressively forced them down, refusing to let the cruel corporate executives see him shed a single drop of sorrow. A father always protects. As Arthur turned his back on the glittering, cruel cathedral of wealth, he felt the intense, burning heat of hundreds of pairs of eyes suddenly tracking his slow, humiliating retreat toward the heavy oak doors. The massive security guards trailed exactly 3 feet behind him, their heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing loudly against the marble floor, intentionally creating a highly visible, public spectacle of his forced removal from the premises. He passed the towering, $3,000 floral archway one last time, the sickeningly sweet scent of the imported white orchids suddenly turning rancid and heavy in his dry throat. The doors closed silently. Marcus Sterling stood near the ice, swan, and smirked triumphantly, casually accepting a fresh flute of vintage champagne from a passing waiter as if he had just successfully swatted away a bothersome insect. He was completely, blissfully unaware that the ragged old man walking out the door was the only biological architect who possessed the exact intellectual key to save his massive, heavily leveraged corporate empire. He mentally crossed the minor aesthetic disturbance off his endless logistical checklist, turning his sharp attention back to the wealthy venture capitalists who held the immediate financial future of his ambitious career. Arrogance is incredibly blind. Arrogance is incredibly blind, but the harsh, unforgiving mathematics of survival never close their tired eyes. Arthur Vance navigated his struggling, rattling sedan back down the steep, winding roads of the Napa Valley, physically leaving the opulent $400,000 celebration in his dusty rearview mirror. The stark, jarring transition from the manicured, pesticide-treated vineyards of the ultra-wealthy back to the cracked asphalt and fading streetlights of Vallejo took exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. The silence in the car was suffocating. Let us temporarily pause to carefully examine the brutal, exact mathematics of systemic poverty that currently governed Arthur's entire existence. His heavily battered checking account held exactly $1,245.18, a terrifyingly fragile buffer against the crushing weight of the modern world. His monthly commercial utility bill for the desperately underfunded community laboratory running out of a converted warehouse space was $612.30. He was constantly running on fumes. At exactly 7:14 in the evening, his cracked smartphone vibrated violently against the worn passenger seat, displaying a deeply familiar, highly anxiety-inducing clinical number. It was Dr. Elena Rostova, the severely overworked head physician at the East Bay Community Health Clinic, calling long after her strict 12-hour shift had supposedly ended. Her voice sounded incredibly hollow, heavily saturated with the unique, devastating exhaustion of a medical professional who had just lost a completely preventable battle against corporate healthcare. The safety net had finally snapped. Arthur pulled the sputtering vehicle over onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 29, the dim, flickering glow of the dashboard illuminating his deeply lined face as he listened to the catastrophic news. The community clinic's primary philanthropic funding grant had just been ruthlessly, unexpectedly revoked by a major corporate sponsor due to sudden, unexplained internal budget reallocations at the corporate executive level. They possessed exactly 42 highly vulnerable, uninsured patients currently relying heavily on the stabilized enzyme treatments Arthur had been quietly manufacturing, and they desperately needed $84,312 by Monday morning just to keep the vital refrigeration units powered. The math was impossible. There is a deeply insidious, heavily researched psychological phenomenon regarding the crushing weight of medical debt in modern society, an invisible trauma that fundamentally rewires the human nervous system. When a human being is forced to constantly calculate the exact monetary value of their own continued survival, their brain shifts into a permanent, highly toxic state of chronic hyperarousal. They stop making ambitious long-term plans for the future and begin exclusively measuring their lives in terrifying 30-day billing cycles and aggressively worded final notice letters. Poverty is a biological disease. Arthur slowly lowered the cracked phone from his ear, staring blankly out through the heavily smeared windshield at the relentless driving rain that had suddenly begun to fall over the darkened highway. He gently placed his calloused right hand on the hand-carved pine box resting on the passenger seat, feeling the smooth, polished wood as if it were a physical anchor holding him to the spinning earth. Inside that tiny, unassuming wooden box was the highly coveted biological blueprint that Helios Biotech was currently preparing to leverage for a staggering $400 million market valuation. He could solve everything with one phone call. If he simply swallowed his pride, turned the rattling sedan around, and drove back to the glittering reception hall at Silver Oak Crest, he could completely surrender to Marcus Sterling's ruthless corporate machinery. He could easily negotiate a massive, life-changing, upfront cash settlement, completely securing the clinic's immediate financial future and instantly wiping away his own crushing, decades-long mountain of personal debt. He would never have to worry about the $600 utility bills, the cracked leather shoes, or the terrifying endless nights desperately trying to synthesize complex proteins with dangerously outdated equipment. The temptation was incredibly powerful. He finally arrived back at his small, drafty suburban house in Vallejo at 8:42 in the evening, his worn corduroy jacket completely soaked through from the short, heavy walk from the flooded driveway. He did not bother turning on the main overhead lights, instead navigating through the familiar, suffocating clutter of his laboratory studied entirely by memory and the pale glow of the street lamp outside. He collapsed heavily into his worn desk chair, the painful, arthritic joints in his knees screaming in silent protest as he gently placed the pine box squarely in the center of his messy workspace. He was completely alone in the dark. The shadows in the small room seemed to physically press down on his chest, visually amplifying the crushing, impossible magnitude of the horrific choice resting entirely upon his tired shoulders. If he handed the exclusive patent over to Helios Biotech, Marcus Sterling had already aggressively outlined the company's brutal, profit-driven strategy in highly publicized financial filings that Arthur had carefully read. They were going to immediately shelf the affordable, generic application of the enzyme and rebrand it as a premium, highly exclusive boutique treatment priced at roughly $4,000 per individual dose, permanently pricing the 42 patients at the community clinic out of their own survival. Corporate greed demands human sacrifices. Arthur slowly lifted the wooden lid of the pine box, his trembling fingers gently bypassing the heavily annotated, yellowed pages of the chemical patent to carefully extract the tiny glass vial resting at the bottom. He unscrewed the delicate black cap, allowing the faint, incredibly sweet and deeply heartbreaking scent of rare orchid essential oil to slowly permeate the stale, chemical-heavy air of the drafty laboratory. The scent instantly transported him back to a freezing hospital room 22 years ago, holding his wife's fragile, failing hand as a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate ruthlessly denied her experimental treatment based entirely on her lack of premium insurance coverage. The pain was still perfectly fresh. She had died not because the complex medical science lacked the proper capability to save her failing organs, but simply because the rigid, unfeeling mathematics of the corporate healthcare system had coldly deemed her life an unprofitable investment. Arthur had spent the last 2 decades obsessively, relentlessly working in the shadows specifically to ensure that no other desperate family would ever have to stare at a hospital billing department and calculate the exact price of their loved one's final breath. To sell the patent to a young executive who had literally thrown him out the back door like trash would be a profound, unforgivable betrayal of every single agonizing hour he had spent grieving her tragic absence. His soul was not for sale. The grandfather clock in the narrow hallway had chimed exactly 11 at night, the deep, resonant metallic sound echoing loudly through the silent, empty house and pulling Arthur back from the crushing depths of his traumatic memories. He carefully screwed the cap back onto the tiny glass vial of orchid oil, his heavily lined face hardening into a strict, terrifying mask of absolute, unshakable scientific resolve. The severe exhaustion that had been dragging down his frail bones for the last 18 hours suddenly evaporated, completely replaced by the cold, highly calculated adrenaline of a brilliant man who had just made an irreversible, world-altering decision. He turned on the flickering desk lamp. He pulled his ancient, heavily modified laptop computer from beneath a towering stack of unread medical journals, the cooling fan immediately whining in loud, desperate protest as the outdated operating system slowly booted up in the dim light. He did not need to negotiate with arrogant corporate executives in tailored Italian suits, nor did he need to beg for basic human decency from a medical system entirely designed to extract maximum financial profit from human suffering. He possessed the raw, undeniable data, the complete molecular synthesis instructions, and the highly encrypted administrative access codes to the International Open Source Biological Registry, maintained by a coalition of independent research universities in Geneva. The game was about to fundamentally change. As the heavy California rain battered aggressively against the single-pane glass of his laboratory window, Arthur Vance began to type rapidly, his calloused fingers flying across the worn plastic keyboard with flawless, terrifying precision. He was going to bypass the $400 million corporate structure entirely, directly releasing the stabilized enzyme manufacturing protocol to a highly secure network of independent, non-profit pharmaceutical cooperatives completely beyond the legal reach of Helios Biotech. He was going to save the 42 patients at the community clinic, and he was going to do it without ever asking for a single cent of compensation or a moment of public recognition from the arrogant men who ruled the world. The true power was in his hands. The true power was in his hands, resting quietly beneath the worn plastic keys of a severely outdated machine. Arthur stared intensely at the flickering computer monitor, his tired eyes tracing the incredibly complex string of biochemical algorithms he had spent 22 years perfecting in absolute secrecy. The upload progress bar crept agonizingly slowly across the cracked screen, a tiny blue line representing the imminent salvation of 42 desperate human lives and the total destruction of a $400 million corporate monopoly. The rusty cooling fan whined loudly in the drafty room. He was dismantling an empire from a wooden chair. He routed the massive data packet through a series of 7 heavily encrypted proxy servers located in Zurich, ensuring that the ruthless corporate lawyers at Helios Biotech could never trace the intellectual leak back to his modest Vallejo laboratory. The upload took exactly 14 minutes and 32 seconds, every single tick of the clock feeling like a heavy physical weight pressing painfully against his aching chest. When the final confirmation dialog box gently popped up on the screen at exactly 2:18 in the morning, Arthur simply closed the cracked laptop and exhaled a long, shaky breath into the cold darkness. The biological sequence was finally free. Exactly 55 hours later, the towering glass and steel architecture of the Apex Meridian building in downtown San Francisco was practically vibrating with toxic corporate anxiety. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table on the 64th floor, his expensive platinum pen hovering confidently over a stack of legal documents that would finalize the hostile acquisition. He had completely forgotten about the ragged old man he had so casually thrown out of his lavish engagement party, his predatory mind entirely focused on the massive 7-figure performance bonus he was about to secure. A panicked corporate attorney abruptly shattered the silence. The senior legal counsel burst through the heavy boardroom doors at precisely 9:14 in the morning, his expensive silk toe wildly skewed and his usually flawless complexion drained of all healthy color. He practically threw his digital tablet onto the polished mahogany surface, aggressively pointing a trembling at a highly technical legal bulletin that had just been aggressively circulated by the International Patent Office in Geneva. The exact molecular structure of the proprietary enzyme, the absolute core foundation of their entire $400 million financial leverage, had been anonymously published to the global open source registry. The exclusive rights were legally dead. Marcus instantly dropped his platinum pen, the heavy metal clattering loudly against the silent table, as his highly trained corporate brain desperately tried to process the catastrophic, impossible reality of the situation. He immediately began aggressively barking orders at the terrified legal team, demanding they deploy millions of dollars in emergency litigation funds to forcefully scrub the data from the internet and silence the unauthorized distributors. The senior attorney looked at the young executive with a mixture of profound pity and absolute terror, explaining that the complex biological sequence had already been legally downloaded 4,312 times by generic manufacturers operating in deeply protected international jurisdictions. Money could not buy back a scientific fact. There is a specific highly predictable stages of grief experienced exclusively by the ultra-wealthy. When they suddenly encounter a massive, systemic problem that completely ignores the sheer volume of their bank accounts, they initially resort to aggressive financial intimidation, throwing massive sums of capital at the crisis under the deeply flawed assumption that every single obstacle in the human world possesses a convenient, easily identifiable price tag. When the aggressive financial bribes inevitably fail against the cold, unfeeling reality of international open-source law, their carefully constructed aura of effortless superiority instantly shatters into 1,000 jagged pieces. Marcus was actively drowning in the boardroom. Richard Whitmore, the incredibly ruthless senior venture capitalist funding the massive acquisition, slowly closed his leather portfolio and stared directly at Marcus with eyes that resembled cold, unfeeling chips of dirty ice. He calmly informed the sweating young executive that the pre-market trading valuation of Helios Biotech had already plummeted by a staggering 34% in the last 19 minutes alone. He demanded a comprehensive, mathematically flawless explanation for how the crown jewel of their biological portfolio had suddenly become completely worthless public domain information on the exact morning of the official signing. The silence in the room was physically suffocating. Marcus aggressively adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his trembling fingers betraying the absolute, mind-numbing panic that was currently rapidly tearing through his tightly structured corporate nervous system. He frantically attempted to blame the catastrophic security breach on corporate espionage, foreign hackers, and incompetent junior analysts, desperately throwing anyone and everyone under the metaphorical bus to protect his own rapidly collapsing position. Richard Whitmore simply stood up, coldly instructed his legal team to prepare a massive gross negligence lawsuit against Marcus personally, and walked out of the room without uttering another single word. The golden boy had fallen completely from grace. While the massive corporate empire was rapidly bleeding millions of dollars in projected market valuations, Arthur Vance was quietly standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of the East Bay Community Health Clinic. He wore the exact same frayed brown corduroy jacket he had worn to the disastrous engagement party, his calloused hands carefully holding a cheap, generic plastic flash drive that he had purchased for exactly $4.99. Dr. Elena Rostova looked at the older scientist with dark, heavily exhausted bags under her eyes, having spent the last 72 hours desperately trying to comfort 42 terrified patients who were completely out of medical options. Arthur gently handed her the plastic drive. He explained to the exhausted physician that he had successfully managed to locate a highly obscure, perfectly legal open-source manufacturing protocol that would allow the underfunded clinic to synthesize the necessary enzyme locally. He completely omitted the fact that he was the original, brilliant architect of the complex formula, deliberately choosing to present himself as a simple, helpful researcher who had merely stumbled upon a convenient administrative loophole. The raw chemical components required for the local synthesis would only cost the clinic roughly $412 a month, a microscopic fraction of the massive corporate price tag that had previously threatened their existence. He gave them back their lives. Dr. Rostova openly wept in the sterile hallway of the clinic, her exhausted tears falling freely as she tightly embraced the frail, quiet man who had just miraculously pulled her entire medical facility back from the absolute brink of total collapse. Arthur awkwardly but gently patted her shoulder, his highly logical mind already calculating the precise thermal calibration required to get the clinic's aging centrifuge up to the exact necessary speed for the upcoming synthesis process. He firmly declined her desperate offers to publicly credit his name on insisting with quiet dignity that the actual work itself was the only reward he ever truly required. He quietly walked back to the laboratory. The contrast between the two men at exactly 2:45 that afternoon was a stunning, flawless masterpiece of profound poetic justice unfolding across the brutal, unforgiving landscape of modern society. Marcus Sterling was currently screaming violently at a terrified junior analyst over a dropped conference call, his bespoke charcoal suit completely wrinkled, and his $89,000 platinum watch feeling like a heavy iron shackle on his trembling wrist. Arthur Vance was peacefully sitting on a rusted metal stool in the clinic's cramped utility closet, humming a gentle, forgotten tune while meticulously applying a specialized industrial lubricant to a squeaking mechanical gear. True power does not scream. The international medical community reacted to the anonymous data dump with unprecedented, overwhelming enthusiasm, completely ignoring the frantic, legally baseless cease and desist letters rapidly firing out of the Helios Biotech legal department. By 4:30 in the afternoon, independent university laboratories in 14 different countries had successfully verified the enzyme synthesis protocol, universally praising the absolute brilliance and flawless mathematical elegance of the anonymous biological architect. The massive pharmaceutical conglomerate completely lost the ability to control the narrative, watching helplessly as their highly guarded proprietary secret became the greatest medical gift freely given to the modern world in the last decade. The playing field was suddenly leveled. Arthur spent the remaining hours of the long afternoon completely ignoring the massive global shockwaves he had just single-handedly created, focusing his entire attention on repairing a faulty refrigeration unit in the clinic's basement. He knelt on the cold, damp concrete floor, his frayed corduroy sleeves rolled up past his elbows as he carefully spliced two frayed copper wires together, using a roll of cheap electrical tape and endless patience. He did not possess a massive mahogany desk or a dedicated team of terrified assistants, but he possessed absolute, unshakable certainty that his actions had profoundly changed the trajectory of the human world. A clean conscience is the ultimate luxury. Back in the suffocating atmosphere of the Apex Meridian building, the Helios Biotech Board of Directors aggressively convened an emergency crisis session, completely excluding Marcus Sterling from the frantic, high-stakes discussions. The young executive paced the length of his lavish corner office like a trapped, desperate animal, desperately, scrolling through his cracked smartphone, searching for any powerful political or financial contact who could magically reverse the undeniable reality of physics. His entire worldview, deeply rooted in the toxic belief that everything in existence could be violently purchased or aggressively intimidated, was completely shattering under the weight of a brilliant man's silent, anonymous sacrifice. Arrogance cannot negotiate with truth. As the sun began to slowly set over the California coastline, casting long, dark shadows across the cracked asphalt of the community clinic parking lot, Arthur finally finished reassembling the heavy refrigeration compressor. He slowly stood up, brushing the thick layer of industrial dust from the knees of his worn trousers, and casually wiped a streak of dark grease from his forehead with the back of his calloused hand. He picked up his battered toolbox and walked out the back door into the cool evening air, completely invisible to the powerful corporate executives currently tearing each other apart in their distant, glittering glass towers. He started the rattling engine of his old sedan. He drove slowly back toward his drafty house in Vallejo, the heavy traffic on the interstate completely unaware that they were sharing the road with the brilliant mind responsible for the greatest medical liberation of the century. The small, hand-carved pine box still sat quietly on the worn passenger seat, the incredibly sweet scent of the rare orchid oil lingering faintly in the stale cabin air as a comforting reminder of the enduring power of profound love. Arthur Vance had looked the most ruthless, heavily armed corporate machinery in the world directly in the eye, and he had utterly defeated it without ever raising his quiet, raspy voice. The blueprint of human dignity remained entirely intact. The blueprint of human dignity remained entirely intact. By 9 the following Tuesday morning, the ruthless financial bleeding at Helios Biotech had completely stabilized into a massive, unrecoverable corporate hemorrhage. The highly aggressive forensic cybersecurity team hired by Richard Whitmore had spent exactly 72 consecutive hours desperately tearing apart the open-source Geneva registry, They were specifically searching for any minor digital anomaly, a tiny microscopic crack in the anonymous architect's flawless encrypted armor that they could brutally exploit for a massive intellectual property lawsuit. They found a ghost. The digital ghost was not a sloppy IP address or a traceable proxy server, but rather a highly specific, idiosyncratic mathematical notation regarding the required thermal calibration of the stabilizing enzyme. It was a completely unique, heavily outdated synthesis equation that had only been published once in a deeply obscure, underfunded scientific journal exactly 28 years ago. The forensic team rapidly cross-referenced the massive global academic database and immediately found the single, lonely name attached to that ancient mathematical paper. Arthur Vance was no longer invisible. When the highly classified forensic report landed on Marcus Sterling's massive mahogany desk at exactly 11:14 in the morning, the young executive experienced a violent physical wave of profound cognitive dissonance. He stared completely blankly at the high-resolution security photograph attached to the digital file, instantly recognizing the frayed, brown corduroy jacket and the deeply lined, tired face of the old delivery man he had so casually banished from his engagement party. The absolute, terrifying realization that he had personally, aggressively thrown a $400 million asset out the back door of a luxury vineyard struck his chest like a physical blow. The irony was suffocating. Marcus did not pause to inform the furious board of directors or consult with his highly paid legal team before sprinting out of the Apex Meridian building. He aggressively commanded his private driver to immediately navigate the sleek, heavily armored corporate town car through the brutal midday traffic toward the deeply impoverished streets of Vallejo. He was frantically clutching a massive, heavily verified corporate cashier's check in his trembling left hand, a desperate financial weapon completely filled with zeros that he foolishly believed could magically erase his catastrophic arrogance. He thought money was a time machine. There is a deeply fascinating sociological study regarding the fundamental inability of the ultra-wealthy to actually comprehend genuine moral conviction when it directly conflicts with their financial interests. When a man has spent his entire professional existence successfully purchasing loyalty, silencing critics, and aggressively burying his own mistakes beneath massive piles of corporate capital, the sheer concept of an incorruptible human being becomes highly offensive. Marcus genuinely believed that every single person on Earth possessed a specific, easily identifiable breaking point, a precise numerical figure that would instantly turn their righteous anger into quiet, compliant gratitude. He was about to learn a brutal lesson. The luxurious black town car aggressively pulled up to the cracked, weed-infested sidewalk outside the East Bay Community Health Clinic at Precise Play 142 in the. Marcus stepped out into the harsh, unforgiving suburban sunlight, his bespoke charcoal suit and $89,000 platinum watch looking incredibly absurd and deeply offensive against the backdrop of peeling paint and desperate poverty. He completely ignored the exhausted, sick patients waiting quietly in the dilapidated reception area, forcefully pushing his way past the overworked administrative staff and marching directly toward the rear utility corridor. He demanded total submission. Arthur Vance was quietly sitting on an overturned plastic bucket in the cramped, heavily chemical-scented laboratory storage room, methodically cataloging a small shipment of generic medical supplies. He was wearing the exact same battered leather shoes, with the deep crack running along the left heel, his thin shoulders hunched comfortably as he carefully recorded the inventory numbers in a cheap spiral notebook. When the heavy wooden door was aggressively shoved open by the frantic young executive, the older scientist did not flinch, jump, or immediately drop his cheap ballpoint pen. He simply kept writing. Marcus stood in the narrow doorway, his chest heaving violently as he desperately tried to reconcile the massive, world-shifting biological brilliance of the open-source data dump with the ragged, deeply unimpressive old man sitting on a plastic bucket. He aggressively stepped into the cramped room, immediately dominating the small physical space with his towering height and the suffocating, toxic scent of his expensive bespoke cologne. He did not offer a single word of genuine apology for the horrific humiliation at the vineyard, immediately launching into a rapid, highly aggressive corporate negotiation designed to overwhelm the older man's senses. Arrogance rarely apologizes. Mr. Vance, I represent the Senior Executive Board of Helios Biotech, and we are currently prepared to offer you an immediate, fully untraceable cash settlement of exactly $5 million to publicly sign a retroactive intellectual property transfer agreement. Marcus slapped the massive cashier's check directly onto the rickety wooden folding table, the heavy paper landing perfectly next to the small hand-carved pine box that Arthur always kept within arm's reach. We possess an army of corporate attorneys who will happily drag you through a decade of brutal, financially devastating federal litigation if you refuse to legally cooperate with our acquisition strategy. The threat was incredibly transparent. Arthur slowly finished writing a specific batch number in his spiral notebook, placed the cap back on his cheap pen, and finally looked up at the sweating, desperate young executive. His tired, deeply intelligent eyes slowly drifted from Marcus's. Violent as can, she's the violent trembling's handles, registering the staggering, life-altering amount of capital being casually offered. $5 million could permanently secure the clinic's operating budget for the next 12 years, completely eradicate his own crushing debt, and instantly provide a level of profound material comfort he had never once experienced in his entire life. He did not touch the paper. You are currently standing in a medical facility that treats 42 highly vulnerable patients who cannot afford basic preventative care, because men in expensive suits decided their continued survival was a negative liability on a corporate spreadsheet. Arthur's raspy voice was incredibly calm, completely devoid of the terrified submission or the greedy, desperate excitement that Marcus had so heavily relied upon for his aggressive negotiation tactics. You looked at me 4 days ago and saw nothing but a filthy delivery man polluting your perfect aesthetic. You look at me and see nothing but an inconvenient legal obstacle that requires a substantial financial bribe. You see absolutely nothing. Marcus aggressively slammed his right hand against the wooden table, causing the small glass vials of generic medication to rattle violently against each other in the tense, heavy silence of the storage room. He loudly declared that Arthur was being incredibly foolish, completely irrational, and dangerously stubborn, aggressively reiterating that the $5 million was more than enough to completely buy back his damaged pride. He genuinely, fundamentally, could not comprehend why this ragged old man was completely refusing to immediately grab the massive check and beg for corporate forgiveness. He was utterly blind to human dignity. I do not want your $5 million, Mr. Sterling, because your money is deeply stained with the horrific, quiet desperation of thousands of sick people who were forced to empty their life savings just to survive the winter. Arthur slowly stood up from the plastic bucket, picking up the small pine box and holding it carefully against his worn corduroy jacket, standing perfectly straight despite the agonizing arthritis in his spine. The only thing I have ever wanted from the massive corporate entities that brutally govern this world is the exact same thing I wanted when I walked into your lavish reception hall 4 days ago. I demand basic respect. Fact. Arthur deliberately picked up the heavy carpet cast check by the absolute corner as if examining a flickering fascinating but completely useless biological specimen. He calmly explained that he had purposely engineered the open-source encryption to automatically trigger a massive, highly publicized digital release of Helios Biotech's internal pricing strategy emails if they ever attempted to file a retaliatory lawsuit against him. He then slowly, methodically tore the $5 million check directly in half, the sharp, crisp sound of the tearing paper echoing like a massive gunshot in the tiny storage room. The empire was broken. He placed the torn pieces of the massive financial bribe gently into the small plastic trash can, completely erasing Marcus Sterling's final, desperate attempt to aggressively purchase his way out of a moral reckoning. You are completely welcome to aggressively maintain your toxic illusions of superiority in your glittering glass towers, but you no longer possess the exclusive power to actively decide who gets to live and who has to die. Now, if you do not mind, I have 3 important centrifuge calibrations to meticulously finish before the evening shift arrives, and your expensive cologne is currently making it very difficult for me to concentrate. Please close the door on your way out. Marcus Sterling stood completely frozen in the center of the cramped utility room, absolute totality of his massive failure crushing down on his perfectly tailored shoulders like a physical weight. The young executive's incredibly toxic, deeply entrenched belief system, the absolute certainty that every single human soul possessed a convenient price tag, had just been violently, irrevocably shattered by an old man in cracked leather shoes. He slowly backed out of the tiny laboratory, his handsome face completely pale and his hands shaking violently as he finally realized the terrifying, unforgiving permanence of his own catastrophic actions. He was completely powerless. He was completely powerless. The harsh, undeniable reality of his massive corporate failure settled heavily into his tailored shoulders as he slowly walked out of the dilapidated community clinic and back into the blinding California sun. He climbed into the back of his luxurious armored town car, aggressively demanding the driver take him immediately to his private penthouse, while completely ignoring the frantic, endless stream of emergency notifications vibrating on his expensive smartphone. He spent the entire agonizing commute staring blankly out the tinted windows, his highly trained executive brain aggressively constructing elaborate, complex mental gymnastics to legally and financially blame everyone else for the catastrophic disaster. Arrogance survives through delusion. Exactly 122 days passed since the massive, unprecedented release of the stabilized enzyme protocol completely and fundamentally restructured the global medical landscape. The towering, arrogant empire of Helios Biotech did not entirely collapse into permanent financial ruin, but it was brutally forced by international regulators to completely dismantle its profit-driven pricing models. Richard Whitmore and the furious executive board aggressively pushed Marcus Sterling out of the massive corporation without a single cent of severance pay, publicly blaming his highly erratic management style for the catastrophic loss of their core proprietary asset. The golden parachute was violently cut. Marcus Sterling did not experience a profound moral awakening or quietly retreat into the peaceful mountains to deeply reflect upon the horrific, deeply toxic nature of his personal philosophy. He simply relocated his aggressive corporate operations to a mid-tier logistics firm in Chicago, aggressively maintaining his exact same deeply flawed belief system while loudly complaining to anyone who would listen that he was a tragic victim of corporate espionage. He still wears his $89,000 platinum watch every single day, desperately clinging to the superficial hollow symbols of absolute power while aggressively punishing junior employees for minor, insignificant administrative errors. Some men choose to die in the dark. Meanwhile, the vibrant, chaotic world operating completely outside of those cold corporate boardrooms experienced a beautiful, profound renaissance of genuine human compassion and incredible scientific progress. The East Bay Community Health Clinic successfully synthesized the critical enzyme within exactly 72 hours, completely saving the lives of the 42 vulnerable patients who had been entirely abandoned by the massive pharmaceutical machine. The unprecedented, undeniable success of the open-source protocol immediately triggered a massive influx of independent philanthropic grants, flooding the struggling clinic with exactly $3,200,000 in long-term operational funding. Empathy is highly contagious. Arthur Vance did not suddenly transform into a wealthy, highly celebrated media personality, completely refusing every single highly lucrative request for national television interviews and aggressive book publishing deals. He still wakes up at exactly 4:15 in the morning every single day, pulling his tired, aging frame from the exact same mattress in his small, drafty suburban house in Vallejo. He still brews his incredibly strong black coffee using the heavily chipped ceramic dripper, enjoying the quiet, peaceful solitude of the freezing pre-dawn darkness before the demanding world fully awakens. The foundation remained entirely unchanged. However, the deeply suffocating, isolating shadows that had previously completely consumed his cluttered laboratory study were now entirely replaced by the bright, energetic hum of a fully funded, collaborative research facility. He had used a massive, completely unsolicited academic grant from an international medical consortium to purchase the abandoned warehouse located exactly 2 blocks from the community clinic, aggressively converting the empty space into a state-of-the-art bioengineering cooperative. He specifically designed the expansive facility entirely outside the toxic, profit-driven influence of corporate venture capital, ensuring that every single brilliant discovery made within those walls would automatically belong to the global public domain. The work was finally safe. At exactly 7:30 on a crisp Tuesday morning, Arthur walked across the polished concrete floor of his new laboratory, wearing a slightly newer, but still incredibly simple and unpretentious brown corduroy jacket. The deep, painful cracks in his old leather shoes had finally been repaired by a skilled local cobbler, allowing him to walk with a steady, comfortable rhythm that completely reflected the profound internal peace he had finally achieved. He stopped by the main administrative desk to carefully review a stack of complex logistical reports, his brilliant mind instantly calculating the precise, necessary thermal adjustments for the upcoming week's highly critical protein synthesis schedule. He was a man completely in his element. Resting exactly in the dead center of his massive, highly organized workspace was the familiar, intricately hand-carved pine box that he had carried through the terrifying gauntlet of the Silver Oak Crest reception hall. The tiny glass vial of rare orchid essential oil remained safely inside, a permanent, beautiful tribute to the profound love and agonizing loss that had violently forced him to challenge the entire corporate medical system. He slowly traced his calloused thumb over the smooth, natural grain of the wooden lid, feeling a deep, powerful sense of closure wash over his tired soul after 2 decades of relentless, deeply isolating struggle. The ghosts were finally resting. The heavy glass doors of the research cooperative opened quietly, and a young, highly nervous university student named Julian walked cautiously into the bright laboratory, carrying a heavily battered, second-hand canvas backpack. Julian was a brilliant, deeply passionate biology major who had been aggressively rejected from 3 prestigious corporate internship programs solely because he could not afford the massive tuition costs required to attend their elite, private networking events. He stood awkwardly near the entrance, looking incredibly small and utterly terrified in his faded gray hoodie and worn canvas sneakers, fully expecting to be brutally dismissed by the legendary scientist who had completely revolutionized the medical industry. History often threatens to repeat itself. Arthur Vance immediately looked up from his complex paperwork, his sharp, highly observant eyes instantly recognizing the exact same crushing, heavy weight of systemic poverty resting directly on the young man's tense shoulders. He did not aggressively demand to see the student's polished academic transcripts, nor did escort Finchnar security to escort the poorly dressed young out of his immaculate, highly expensive research facility. He simply closed his file folder, offered a gentle, deeply welcoming smile that crinkled the deep lines around his tired eyes, and walked slowly toward the terrified intern with his calloused hand extended in genuine warm greeting. Respect costs absolutely nothing. Arthur carefully pulled a heavy, spiral-bound notebook filled with incredibly complex, handwritten biochemical equations from the top drawer of his desk and gently placed it directly into Julian's trembling hands. He spent the next 4 hours patiently, meticulously explaining the foundational mechanics of molecular stabilization to the young student, completely ignoring his own highly demanding administrative schedule to prioritize the intellectual growth of the next generation. He looked directly at the young man in the faded hoodie and saw absolutely limitless, beautiful potential actively refusing to judge the brilliant mind based on the deeply unimpressive, severely underfunded presentation of his clothing. A true architect builds other people. The massive, heavily guarded corporate institutions of the modern world will always desperately attempt to convince you that human value is entirely derived from the aggressive accumulation of wealth and the brutal exercise of leverage. They will loudly demand that you strictly measure a person's entire worth by the tailored cut of their expensive Italian suit, the heavy platinum weight of their luxury wristwatch, and the terrifying cold exclusivity of their highly restricted social circles. They want you to firmly believe that the quiet, heavily calloused hands of the working class are only useful for maintaining the invisible infrastructure that allows the arrogant elite to comfortably look down upon the rest of humanity. Do not believe the illusion. The true, undeniable measure of a person's character is never aggressively broadcast in the glittering, artificial light of a $400,000 engagement party surrounded by people who secretly despise each other. It is quietly, permanently forged in the darkest, most terrifying moments of isolated desperation. When the brutal mathematics of survival demand that you completely sacrifice your own moral compass just to keep the lights on for another month. It is discovered in the agonizing silent spaces between a heavily patched corduroy sleeve and a cracked leather shoe, where dignity absolutely refuses to die despite the crushing weight of systemic humiliation. Character is what remains when the money burns. Have you ever found yourself standing in a crowded room watching a quiet, unassuming person being aggressively diminished, casually ignored, or brutally cast aside, simply because they lacked the superficial, hollow markers of societal success? Did you quietly look away and silently conform to the toxic, unspoken rules of the room, or did you possess the incredibly rare, profound courage to actively challenge the crushing arrogance of the overwhelming majority? We are constantly writing the complex, deeply permanent blueprint of our own souls through every single minor interaction we have with the people who can offer us absolutely nothing in return. The choice is always yours. If this story resonated with something deep, genuine, and unapologetically real inside your chest, please take exactly 1 second to hit that like button and aggressively share this message with someone who desperately needs a reminder of their own inherent worth. Leave a comment down below detailing a specific time you completely misjudged someone based on their outward appearance, or a time you successfully proved the arrogant, heavily biased critics completely wrong through your own quiet, undeniable competence. I read every single comment because your unique, powerful stories are the absolute foundation of this growing, deeply connected community. Keep building the blueprint,